Today, I got some chamomile tea. So I'm gonna put it there. And let it steep for a little bit. About 5-10 minutes. In the meantime, I can read another chapter. Chapter 24. If the Dharma bums ever get lay brothers in America who live normal lives with wives and children and homes, they will be like Sean Monahan. Sean was a young carpenter who lived in an old wooden house far up a country road from the huddled cottages of Corte Madera. Drove an old jalopy, personally added a porch to the back of the house to make a nursery for later children, and had selected a wife who agreed with him in every detail about how to live the joyous life in America without much money. Sean liked to take days off from his job to just go up the hill to the shack, which belonged to the property he rented, and spend a day of meditation and study of the Buddhist sutras and just brewing himself pots of tea and taking naps. His wife was Christine, a beautiful young honey-haired girl, her hair falling way down over her shoulders, who wandered around the house and yard barefooted, hanging up wash and baking her own brown bread and cookies. She was an expert on making food out of nothing. The year before, JP had made them an anniversary gift, which was a huge 10-pound bag of flour, and they were very glad to receive it. Sean, in fact, was just an old-time patriarch. Though he was only 22, he wore a full beard like St. Joseph, and in it you could see his pearly white teeth smiling and his young blue eyes twinkling. They already had 2 little daughters, who also wandered around barefooted in the house and yard and were brought up to take care of themselves. Sean's house had woven straw mats on the floor, and there, too, when you came in, you were required to take off your shoes. He had lots of books, and the only extravagance was a hi-fi set so he could play his fine collection of Indian records and flamenco records and jazz. He even had Chinese and Japanese records. The dining table was a low, black lacquered Japanese-style table, and to eat in Sean's house, you not only had to be in your socks, but sitting on mats at this table, any way you could. Christine was a great one for delicious soups and fresh biscuits. When I arrived there at noon that day, getting off the Greyhound bus and walking up the tar road about a mile, Christine immediately had me sit down to hot soup and hot bread with butter. She was a gentle creature. Sean and Japhie were both working on his job at Sausalito. They'll be home about 5. I'll go up to the shack and look at it and wait up there this afternoon. Well, you can stay down here and play records. Well, I'll get out of your way. You won't be in my way. All I'm gonna do is hang out the wash and bake some bread for tonight and mend a few things. With a wife like that, Sean, working only desultorily at carpentry, had managed to put a few $1,000s in the bank. And like a patriarch of old, Sean was generous. He always insisted on feeding you, and if 12 people were in the house, he'd lay out a big dinner, a simple dinner but delicious, on a board outside in the yard, and always a big jug of red wine. It was a communal arrangement, though he was strict about that. We'd make collections for the wine, and if people came, as they all did, for a long weekend, they were expected to bring food or food money. Then at night, under the trees and the stars of his yard, with everybody well fed and drinking red wine, Sean would take out his guitar and sing folk songs. Whenever I got tired of it, I'd climb my hill and go to sleep. After eating lunch and talking a while to Christine, I went up the hill. It climbed steeply right at the back door. Huge ponderosas and other pines, and in the property adjoining Sean's, a dreamy horse meadow with wildflowers and 2 beautiful bays with their sleek necks bent to the butterfat grass in the hot sun. Boy, this is going to be greater than North Carolina woods, I thought, starting up. In the slope of grass was where Sean and Japhie had felled 3 huge eucalyptus trees and had already bucked them, sawed whole logs with a chainsaw. Now the block was set, and I could see where they had begun to split the logs with wedges and sledgehammers and double-bitted axes. The little trail up the hill went so steeply that you almost had to lean over and walk like a monkey. It followed a long cypress row that had been planted by the old man who had died on a hill a few years ago. This prevented the cold, foggy winds from the ocean from blasting across the property unhindered. There were 3 stages to the climb: Sean's backyard, then a fence, forming a little pure deer park where I actually saw a deer one night. 5 of them, resting. The whole area was a game refuge. Then the final fence, the top grassy hill with its sudden hollow on the right, where the shack was barely visible under trees and flowery bushes. Behind the shack, a well-built affair, actually of 3 big rooms, but only 1 room occupied by Jaffe, was plenty of good firewood, and a sawhorse and axes, and an outdoor privy with no roof, just a hole in the ground and a board. It was like the first morning in the world in Fine Yard, with the sun streaming in through the dense sea of leaves, and birds and butterflies jumping around, warm, sweet, the smell of higher hill heathers and flowers beyond the barbed wire fence, which led to the very top of the mountain and showed you a vista of all the Marin County area. I went inside the shack. On the door was a board with Chinese inscriptions on it. I never found out what it meant. Probably Mara, stay away, Mara the tempter. Inside I saw the beautiful simplicity of Jaffe's way of living, neat, sensible, strangely rich without a cent having been spent on the decoration. Old clay jars exploded with bouquets of flowers picked around the yard. His books were neatly stacked in orange crates. The floor was covered with inexpensive straw mats. The walls, as I say, were lined with burlap, which is one of the finest wallpapers you can have. Very attractive and nice smelling. Jaffe's mat was covered with a thin mattress and a paisley shawl over that, and at the head of it, neatly rolled for the day, his sleeping bag. Behind burlap drapes, in a closet with his rucksack and junk were put away from sight. From the burlap wall hung beautiful prints of old Chinese silk paintings and maps of Marin County and Northwest Washington and various poems he'd written and just stuck on a nail for anybody to read. The latest poem superimposed over others on the nail said, "It started just now with a hummingbird stopping over the porch 2 yards away through the open door, then gone. It stopped me studying, and I saw the old redwood post leaning in clawed ground, tangled in a huge bush of yellow flowers higher than my head, through which I push every time I come inside. The shadow network of the sun shine through its vines. White-crowned sparrows make tremendous singings in the trees. The rooster down the valley crows and crows. Sean Monahan outside. Behind my back reads the Diamond Sutra in the sun. Yesterday I read Migration of Birds. The golden plover and the Arctic tern. Today that big abstraction's at my door, for juncos and the robins soon will leave, and nesting scrabblers will pick up all the string, and soon in hazy day of April summer heat across the hill, without a book I'll know, the seabirds'll chase spring north along the coast. They'll be nesting in Alaska in 6 weeks." And it was signed, Japheth M. Ryder, Cypress Cabin, 18/3/56. I didn't want to disturb anything in the house till he got back from work, so I went out and lay down in the tall green grass in the sun and waited all afternoon, dreaming. But then I realized I might as well make a nice supper for Jaffe, and I went down the hill again and down the road to the store and bought beans, salt pork, various groceries, and came back and lit a fire in the wood stove and boiled up a good pot of New England beans with molasses and onions. I was amazed at the way Jaffe stored his food. Just on a shelf by the wood stove, 2 onions, an orange, a bag of wheat germ, cans of curry powder, rice, mysterious pieces of dried Chinese seaweed, a bottle of soy sauce to make his mysterious Chinese dishes. His salt and pepper was all neatly wrapped up in little plastic wrappers bound with elastic. There wasn't anything in the world Jaffe would ever waste or lose. Now I was introducing into his kitchen all the big substantial pork and beans of the world. Maybe he wouldn't like it. He also had a big chunk of Christine's fine brown bread, and his bread knife with a dagger simply stuck into the board. It got dark. I waited in the yard, letting the pot of beans keep warm on the fire. I chopped some wood and added it to the pile behind the stove. The fog began to blow in from the Pacific. The trees bowed deeply and roared. From the top of the hill, you could see nothing but trees. Trees, a roaring sea of trees. It was paradise. As it got cold, I went inside and stoked up the fire, singing, and closed the windows. The windows were simply removable, opaque plastic pieces that had been cleverly carpentered by Whitney Jones, Christine's brother. They let in the light, but you couldn't see anything outdoors, and they cut off the cold wind. Soon it was warm in the cozy cabin. By and by I heard a hoo out in the roaring sea of fog trees, and it was Jaffe coming back. I went out to greet him. He was coming across the tall final grass, weary from the day's work, clomping along in his boots, his coat over his back. "Well, Smith, here you are. I cooked up a nice pot of beans for you." "You did?" He was tremendously grateful. "Boy, what a relief to come home from work and don't have to cook up a meal yourself. I'm starved." He pitched right into the beans with bread and hot coffee I made in a pan on the stove, just French-style brewing coffee stirred with a spoon. We had a great supper, and then lit up our pipes and talked with the fire roaring. "Ray, you're going to have a great summer up on that Desolation Peak. I'll tell you all about it. I'm going to have a great spring right here in this shack." "Darn right. First thing we do this weekend is invite some nice new girls I know, Psyche and Polly Whitmore. Though wait a minute, I can't invite both of them. They both love me, and they'll be jealous. Anyway, we'll have big parties every weekend, starting downstairs at Sean's and ending up here. And I'm not working tomorrow, so we'll cut some firewood for Sean. That's all he wants you to do. Though, if you want to work on that job of ours in Sausalito next week, you can make $10 a day." "Fine. That'll buy a lot of pork and beans and wine." Jaffe pulled out a fine brush drawing of a mountain. "Here's your mountain. That'll loom over you. Hozomin." I drew it myself 2 summers ago from Crater Peak. In 1952, I first went into that Skagit country, hitched from Frisco to Seattle, and then in with the beard, just started a bare-shaved head. Bare-shaved head? Why? To be like a bhikkhu. You know what it says in that sutras. But what did people think about you hitchhiking around with a bare-shaved head? They thought I was crazy, but everybody that gave me a ride, I'd spin him the Dharma boy and leave him enlightened. I should have done a bit of that myself, hitching out here just now. I gotta tell you about my arroyo in the desert mountains. Wait a minute. So they put me on Crater Mountain lookout, but the snow was so deep in the high country that year I worked trail for a month. In Granite Creek Gorge, you'll see all those places. And then with a string of mules, we made it the final 7 miles of winding Tibetan rock trail above timber line, over snowfields to the final jagged pinnacles, and then climbed the cliffs in the snowstorm. And I opened my cabin and cooked my first dinner while the wind held and the ice grew on 2 walls in the wind. Boy, wait till you get up there. That year my friend Jack Joseph was on Desolation, where you'll be. What a name, Desolation. Ooh, wow, ugh, wait. He was on the first lookout to go up. I got him on my radio first off, and he welcomed me to the community of lookouts. Later, I contacted other mountains. See, they give you a 2-way radio. It's almost a ritual. All the lookouts chat and talk about bears they've seen, or sometimes ask instructions for how to bake muffins on a wood stove, and so on. And we all were in a high world talking on a net of wireless across hundreds of miles of wilderness. It's a primitive area, where you're going, boy. From my cabin, I could see the lamps of Desolation after dark, Jack Joseph reading his geology book, and in the day we flashed by mirror to align our firefinder transits accurate to the compass. Gee, how will I ever learn that? I'm just a simple poet bum. Oh, you'll learn. The magnetic pole, the pole star, and the northern lights. Every night, Jack Joseph and I talked. One day, he got a swarm of ladybugs on the lookout that covered the roof and filled up his water cistern. Another day, he went for a walk along the ridge and stepped right on a sleeping bear. Oh, ho, I thought this place was wild. This is nothing. And when the lightning storm came by, closer and closer, he called to finally say he was going off the air because the storm was too close to leave his radio on. He disappeared from sound and then sight as the black clouds swept over the light and the lightning danced on his hill. But as the summer passed, desolation got dry and flowery and blaky lambs, and he wandered the cliffs, and I was on Crater Mountain in my jockstrap and boots hunting out ptarmigan nests out of curiosity, climbing and looking and poking about, getting bit by bees. Desolation's way up there, Ray, 6,000 feet or so up, looking into Canada and the Chelan Hills, the wilds of the Picket Range, and the mountains like Challenger, Terror, Fury, Despair, and the name of your own ridge is Starvation Ridge, and the upcountry of the Boston Peak of Buckner Peak Range, and the upcountry of the Boston Peak and Buckner Peak Range, to the south thousands of miles of mountains, deer, bear, conies, hawks, trout, chipmunks. It'll be great for you, Ray. I look forward to it, okay? I bet no bee bites me. Then he took out his books and read a while, and I read too, both of us with separate oil lamps banked low, a quiet evening at home as the foggy wind roared in the trees outside, and across the valley a mournful mule hee-hawed on in one of the most tremendously heartbroken cries I've ever heard. When that mule weeps like that, says Japhy, I feel like praying for all the sentient beings. Then for a while he meditated motionless in the full lotus position on his mat, and then said, well, time for bed. But now I wanted to tell him all the things I'd discovered that winter meditating in the woods. It's just a lot of words, he said. He said sadly, surprising me. I don't want to hear all your word descriptions of words you made up all winter. Man, I want to be enlightened by actions. Japhy had changed since the year before too. He no longer had his goatee, which had removed the funny, merry little look of his face, but left him looking gaunt and rocky-faced. Also, he'd cut his hair in a close crew cut and looked Germanic and stern and above all sad. There seemed to be some kind of disappointment in his face now, and certainly in his soul. He wouldn't listen to my eager explanations that everything was all right forever and forever and forever. Suddenly, he said, I'm gonna get married soon, I think. I'm getting tired of batting around like this. But I thought you'd discovered the Zen ideal of poverty and freedom. Maybe I'm getting tired of all that. After I come back from the monastery in Japan, I'll probably have my fill of it anyhow. Maybe I'll be rich and work and make a lot of money and live in a big house. But a minute later, and who wants to enslave himself to a lot of all that, though? I don't know, Smith. I'm just depressed, and everything you're saying just depresses me further. My sister's back in town, you know. Who's that? That's Rhoda, my sister. I grew up with her in the woods in Oregon. She's gonna marry this rich jerk from Chicago, and a real square. My father's having trouble with his sister too, my Aunt Nos. She's an old bitch from way back. You shouldn't have cut off your goatee. You used to look like a happy little sage. Well, I ain't a happy little sage no more, and I'm tired. He was exhausted from a long, hard day's work. We decided to go to sleep and forget it. In fact, we were a bit sad and sore at each other. During the day, I had discovered a spot by a wild rose bush in the yard where I planned to lay out my sleeping bag. I'd covered it a foot deep with fresh pulled grass. Now, with my flashlight and my bottle of cold water from the sink tap, I went out there and rolled into the beautiful night's rest under the sighing trees, meditating a while first. I couldn't meditate indoors anymore like Japhy had just done. After all that winter in the woods of night, I had to hear the little sounds of animals and birds and feel the cold sighing earth under me before I could rightly get to feel a kinship with all living things as being empty and awake and saved already. I prayed for Japhy. It looked like he was changing for the worse. At dawn, a little rain pattered on my sleeping bag, and I put my poncho over me instead of under me, cursing, and slept on. At 7 in the morning, the sun was out, and the butterflies were in the roses by my head, and a hummingbird did a jet dive right down at me, whistling, and darted away happily. But I was mistaken about Japhy changing. It was one of the greatest mornings in our lives. There he was standing in the doorway of the shack with a big frying pan in his hand, banging on it and chanting Buddham Saranam Gochami, Dhammam Saranam Gochami, Sangam Saranam Gochami, and yelling, "Come on, boy, your pancakes are ready. Come and get it. Bang, bang, bang." And the orange sun was pouring in through the pines, and everything was fine again. In fact, JP had contemplated that night, and decided I was right about hewing to the good old Dharma. I think my tea's ready.